This is Kevin. Very first study in our brand new series, 3 Waves of Prophets. Why is it called that? We're going to be going through 17 books of the Old Testament that all share the same genre. These are the writing prophets. There's 17 of them, a large number. Because of that, we're going to be making one of our main goals for the series, a breaking down of those 17 into bite-sized pieces. And you can see this graphic that I'm putting up on the screen, that all 17 of these books can be grouped into one of these 3 categories, into one of these 3 big historical contexts. And so you'll see the first one, for example, it refers to in 722 BC, King Sargon II of Assyria comes in with this 3rd wave of armies, and he completely destroys the society of Israel. And he takes the survivors and he scatters them across the regions, and as a society they're never heard from again. So that's a big, giant, looming context, isn't it? And just knowing that is going to help us understand some of the stuff that these guys are saying in their texts. And further, you can tell that some of these prophets are probably contemporaries of one another, or maybe even they're colleagues of each other. They share a similar message, or they're at least speaking to the same audience. So making all those connections is really going to help. Okay, so this is kind of important before we go into any more, is what is the nation of Israel in the first place? We know that they're God's chosen people. 1406 BC, they entered the land of Canaan. Eventually they get their act together and they become one nation. They make a kingship of themselves. But it didn't take very long before infighting, and they divided it into 2 parts. And so even though all of it is called Israel, or they're called all Israel, and even though when they're divided, then each of the portions are still called Israel technically. When they're a divided nation, more often than not, the northern part is referred to as Israel or Samaria, more often Israel, and the southern part is referred to as Judah. And the reason that's important is during the times that the prophets are writing these things, they're going to be called by God to usually speak to one or the other, okay? So Amos is a good book for us to start out on. And it's because in addition to the historical context, we're also going to be learning some poetic intelligence. See, Amos, we'll read in chapter 1, he is from the south, from Judah, and God calls him to go and preach tough things to the north, and they don't want to hear it, right? And so he starts off with an audience that doesn't want to listen to him. And so he's using poetic stunts in this first chapter plus verses in order to grab their attention. And so what Amos ends up doing is he gives this international roll call. He's naming not Israel and its faults, but all of Israel's enemies and their faults. You can see how he's kind of building a crescendo over time of a chorus of amens, right, from the audience of Israel. And he's saying Gaza and Syria and Ammon and Moab and Judah. And he's saying for 3 sins that you committed, even a 4th, God's going to crush you. For 3 sins that you committed, even a 4th, God's going to crush you. And these guys are listening in on this, and they're going, yeah. And we know about the number 7, right? He actually goes through 7 enemy nations of Israel, and they think the roll call's over. And at the very end, then Amos says, for 3 sins, even a 4th one, God is going to crush you, Israel. And he even goes into more detail about that. So it turns out that Amos is actually pegging Israel in this international roll call, but he's gaining their attention with that poetic stunt that he's utilizing. And it's also kind of interesting to know what's with the 3 plus 1, the 3 sins in 1. Is that 3 strikes and you're out, plus 1 if you have a dispute over one of them? Is it the 4th one is the straw that broke the camel's back? You can discuss it in your groups, what that poetry is doing. But this is an intro to Amos. Next week, we'll cover the rest of it. This is a passage that my own favorite hero, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., loved to go to and quote and utilize, and you're going to see why, all right? Until then, peace out.